Hello and welcome to another episode of the Paal15 Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Gray, and I'm joined today by my colleague in Australia, Laila Selena. Laila, how are you doing?
Oh, good. Thanks, Matt.
Good to have you with us. And we're delighted to be joined by our special guest for today's episode, Rob Hotchin, Country Manager at Privy Australia. Rob, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. Now, on the Paal15 podcast, we're always on the hunt for fascinating business stories from the world of B2B technology, and especially when we see businesses moving into new markets geographically and internationally. And that's something that Rob has been a key part of at Privy recently. And we'll go on, I'm sure, to hear all about it. But first, I think we want to find out a bit more about the man himself.
That's right. Rob, take us through your background. What drew you into the industry and to your current role with Privy?
Yeah, well, my background, funny enough, crossed over with yours, Laila, right?
So, oh, I know. We have a dark past.
Yeah. No, it wasn't dark. It wasn't dark. It was just a long time ago.
Yeah.
I was in sales and enjoying it, and I found myself working for an event management company, and one of their shows was actually the Cloud Expo. And upon trying to re-sign that company called Rackspace, who are an MSP, this is back in 2011, trying to get them to buy another stand space for the next year, they basically offered me a job and said, do I want to come and sell the cloud? And that was kind of my entering. There was no kind of foresight. It was perfect timing because cloud kicked off at like 2012, 2013. It started going crazy in Amazon Web Services and Azure and so on. But I'd love to say that was a really good strategic move, but it was just coincidence that I wanted to move to London. They offered me a move to London, and that's kind of the beginning. And then from there, I've kind of somewhat fallen in love with tech. The ever-changing nature of technology, where it feels like every 6 months it reinvents itself and there's a new buzzword, whether it was public cloud when I first started, and then it was big data and DevOps, and now we're in the world of AI and ML and all those pieces as well. So it's that ever-changing world that really kind of drew me in. It was coincidence or fortune that got me in, and then it was that world that's not stopped changing that kind of kept me in it.
Can you explain to us a little bit more about what Privy is, what it does, what's the company's mission?
Yeah, how good a job has Paal done? That's what you're going to ask me now, by how well can I explain this? So, look, we are a reusable digital identity. So the best way of explaining that is whenever you apply for, let's say, a credit card or something, you have to do a certain amount of checks. And that'll be submitting your driving license or your passport. And the way that society is built today, we have a physical ID for the digital world. So the passport works great at the airport. It doesn't work so great online. So how do we create a way of being able to verify yourself once, reuse that credential so you don't have to do the laborious, repetitive motion of every time you apply for something, you have to take a picture of your passport, or even like you'd go into a real estate agent or a hotel and they photocopy it. How do we stop those behaviors and make it really easy, not only to verify yourself, but to manage your identity? So a really good use case is as you go through and you one click to apply because you've already pre-verified with Privy, you build your subscription. So if I don't want company X to have my data anymore, I can retract it. Or if I change my address, I can update my address in my Privy app, and that updates it to all my vendors instead of having to call them all up and email them all to change my address. Or my favorite one, because I've gone through it recently, which is when my wife changed her surname to my surname, it was a horrible rigmarole to go through. And we ended up having to cancel flights and rebook them and so on. And it was just a really horrible experience for something that should have been positive because we just got married. But if we did that using Privy, you could update the surname. You have to verify it to ensure that you're doing it legitimately. You might take a picture of your wedding certificate or whatever. And then that would update all your providers. They get a notification to go, Sophie has changed her surname to Hotchin. And then they can react positively. So if the iconic, or you have ASOS or ASOS in the UK, if you update them and go, look, I've changed my surname, they can go, great, we'll change it in our database, and then we'll react by giving you 50% off your next purchase for your honeymoon outfit, right? How do we change that experience of handling my identity from what is today a really negative and unsafe one to a really positive, and secure one?
Privy launched in Indonesia, I'm right?
Yes.
Achieved pretty good level of success in that home market, and then you decided to look elsewhere. So what kind of drove that aim to look into new markets?
So they exploded in Indonesia, did really well. 50 odd million users, 400,000 customers, everyone from AXA and Allianz through to Pizza Hut. Pretty much everyone uses Privy in Indo, but they'd never left. And then we went through our Series C funding. KKR came in, a big PE firm, and said, what you have is world leading and really, really good. Let's go and take that to the rest of the world. So there was a number of points why Australia made sense. Geographically, it's close. That's helpful. But it was more a case of, so Australia is used globally as the guinea pig, especially in the Western market. So if Facebook or Instagram release a new feature, they release it in Australia first before anyone else. And the reason being, there's just less people. So you reach market adoption quicker. So you know if it's going to tip over and work or not. Because if you do it in the US, you might get 20 million people liking it, but it's still not market adoption. Where 20 million people here is almost our whole population. So it's quite common for people to use Australia as a test bed and a guinea pig, as well as we've been beaten up in Australia with identity. So we've had, I think 60% of adult Australians have their personal identity data on the dark web already being sold to the highest bidder. So we're in a very fragile state. So there's a pull from society saying we need to do better. There's a new government legislation coming in, as well as the other kind of factors, the kind of macroeconomics of it.
What was the kind of process that you went through for that kind of launch in Australia? What are the biggest challenges that you maybe identified at the start?
Look, I think a lot of the challenges that we went through wouldn't necessarily be challenges that others would go through. It really depends on how you're moving. So we put the cart before the horse, and the cultural shift between Indonesia and Australia, and a lot of that developing world and the developed world, is that in a developing world, labor is cheap, tech is expensive. And then in a developed world, it's the other way around. So that, not just on a how you operate level. So I turn up to a meeting, I've got an agenda, I've got an objective, and it's 30 minutes, and you're in and you're out, and there's not much small talk. Where in Indonesia, 30 people might turn up, and you chit-chat for the first hour and a half. And so how you approach culture, as well as the technology aspect, right? So technology in Indonesia, if it's asking someone to do data entry to kind of get to the outcome, that's fine. I can employ someone to do that. But in Australia, anything that touches labor is bad because it's really expensive. So those challenges was a real cultural shift, and there was a bigger jump from a product perspective of what the product needed to be than what we initially thought.
Any other challenges that you can think of now?
And I think it's that top line strategy around what do you want. And I think we were confused a little bit between, because there's three options if you're coming for, well, there were three options for Privy. It was option A, do we want to supplement the Indonesian revenue with a little bit of Australian revenue? And there's nothing wrong with that. Option B is, do we want to build an Australian company? Or option C is, do we want to build a global company, and Australia is just the first cab off the rank? And I think that we were a little bit confused as to what we were doing, and we kind of did a bit of all of it, where if we just picked one of those options and done that well, we would have been better off.
What was the process that you came to when you picked? Did you refine that into one of those options then? Did you pick that direction eventually?
Well, the answer is, so there's a strategy and there's an approach, right? So the strategy is always is for us to be a global business. But the approach aligns to all three of those in a sense of we gate it. So we start off being a smaller business looking for some supplementary revenue. And then once we achieve that, that opens the next gate to then go, right, now we want to be a larger Australian business. And then when we achieve that, then that opens the gate for we want to go global, which is now the right way of doing it, like milestone based, if you like. Whereas before, we were a bit confused and we were doing some big picture stuff when we probably shouldn't have been. The other big challenge that we have is what we have is conceptually nuanced in a sense of, like, imagine if you remember the early days of like Airbnb and someone's like, hang on, you're going to stay in someone else's house? That's weird. And now it's just accepted. The same with Uber was a bit of an easier one, but if you went all the way back to Henry Ford and looking at selling a car to someone with a horse, I think a big part of what we're having to do is educate the market on the concept of reusable digital ID before we can actually talk about the product and the business. And that for us, we're probably spending a lot of money helping others, not just helping ourselves. So we don't have a direct tie of what we're doing to an ROI, bringing in revenue into the business, which is a real challenge. So I think I was watching something the other day around basically every startup, and we are really a startup within Australia, just part of a bigger business, but it is always too early. And that's the challenges they face. They talked about, I was watching this thing, it was talking about the Newton. The Newton was around in the 80s. It was basically the iPad. It was brilliant. It was just too early to market. And then the iPad came out 20 years later and it dominated. It wasn't new. The Newton had access to the internet, had everything. It was just too early. So I think it's a case of you want to be first mover and early, but how early do you want to be? And I think that's a big piece of trying to understand that, because that dictates everything, your approach and how much you spend and who do you talk to and how do you do it.
But do you find you're getting quite a good response from the Australian market, even though you're spending a lot of time on educating the market, and that's obviously time consuming?
Huge response. So from both, so we basically have two customers. We have a consumer and an enterprise. So the consumer loves it because the way that we work is once you've verified yourself, we actually delete all your data. We don't keep it. And then when you apply for someone, we share, it's basically a green tick, like an audit trail that says, we checked this data 2 months ago and it's all good. So your data is super safe. So if these companies are getting hacked, they can't steal your personal data. So it's really safe, really secure. So from a consumer standpoint, that plus they get to manage it. Like everyone's had that hassle of moving house or changing their name. Like I did it's called an identity sprawl. When you give your identity out, but you have no ledger of who's got it. I did a search the other day. There was 516 companies with my passport.
Wow.
Because it gets like it gets shifted on, right? So if you share to, I don't know, you go for a mortgage, there might be a broker, there might be a mortgage lender, there might be multiple people who share your details. And the financial law says they have to keep it for 7 years after you finish as a customer. So there might be 10 people sharing it then, holding it for maybe 10, 12 years. So it's just the sprawl of data and you've got no ledger over who has it. When a digital ID world, I've got a ledger of exactly who has it. Not only that, I can actually see there's a log as whenever that data is queried. So if someone searches my data and hits the database and goes, I want to check Rob's date of birth, I can look at who that is. So I get a little log. And the same way on your credit card, if it says these transactions, you go, that's not right, I'm going to query that, right? Because you're in control of your own identity, right? It's your most authentic asset. You should control it. And today we don't have any control. So I think from a consumer perspective, people love it. And from an enterprise perspective, they don't want the risk of holding that data. They legally have to, but they don't want to. And they've got to collect it. It stops them from being able to get new customers. So both sides love it conceptually. The difference is getting it actually into motion. And I talk a lot about the first domino. What's the first domino that's going to fall? And I'm a big subscriber of the Geoffrey Moore, Crossing the Chasm, build a beachhead. And our biggest challenge has been finding what that beachhead needs to be, because it felt like it was meant to be financial, FSI, fintech. And we're realizing more and more it's actually not that. We're finding a really great avenue in like the hire of equipment space, because it's less legislative driven. we're replacing a lot of manual stuff. So there's some easy ROI wins to get. And if I'm a tradie and each week I have to go and hire a wheelbarrow or whatever I'm doing, and I have to hand over my driving license each time and they photocopy it each time, whatever. This is a great use case to go in there and solve for that. So finding that beachhead is what's been the challenge. But now we've got it. I'm hoping we've got an eye on that first domino. And then it's downhill.
So yeah, it's interesting. You kind of talk about how the message seems to be resonating with different audiences there. And then kind of how healthy is the kind of the market for digital identity solutions and products at the moment? What are you seeing kind of within the industry?
Yeah, it's interesting. So digital identity as a whole is about $30 billion market. And there's I'm going to do it disjustice. There's three kind of groups. There's your identity access management group, which is kind of what I say sits in the middle of it. That's your Okta of the world and Ping Identity and those sorts of providers. You've got your security pieces that secure those identities in a sense, like your CrowdStrikes and so on. And then there's this bit on the front of it, which is the verification. That doesn't have any big players. You've got people like Expedient who do kind of checks of people, so making sure that it's like anti-money laundering checks and so on. But from an actual provider of identities, and that's a sensitive topic or way of phrasing it because people feel like I'm selling identities. It's not that. We look at it as more being a custodian. But that market is empty and open. And I think it's new, but it's very much unspoken. And I think for me, when I fast forward 10 years, I see maybe even more than that, depending on how quickly this is adopted. Pretty much every single person in the developed world will have at least one, probably 2 or 3 digital IDs that they use to hire a car or even go into a bar, right? And we think about today, if you go into some of the bars you go into and they'll take a picture on their little machine of your driving license or whatever. When you're doing that, you're sharing your address. I'm sharing that I can ride a motorbike. I'm sharing all sorts of things. All I need to know is I'm over 18. So I'm oversharing whenever I do that. All I should be able to do is go scan my QR code, says I'm over 18, let me in, right? That's all I need to share. So I think that it's a really undervalued market. And that's one of our challenges is there's not this big, huge West Coast software company waving the flag for us. We're having to build all of that ourselves, which is really challenging. There's a great company in the UK called Yoti. They're doing a really good job at kind of building awareness around that. But there's no one really in the US and there's no one in Australia.
So a big opportunity to fill that gap in the market then.
Yeah. If the market can work, like I truly believe that you'll see Apple turn around and do this, and a Google and whoever else, all those ones where you know how you do a sign up with Google or sign up with Facebook or whatever those things are. It will fold into that world because they'll quickly realize this is something that's fundamentally every human on the planet will need it, pretty much. If you want to interact with the world, and the world is a digital world, so I need a digital ID.
Let's change pace a little bit. Go back to you. Obviously, I can notice, some of our listeners obviously will probably have noticed as well that you're not from Australia originally. So I'm kind of want to ask you a little bit about that. It sounds like you're from the UK, just like me. Can you draw any parallels between starting a life in a new country and kind of moving a business into a new market?
No, I don't think so. Like it's very different. Yes, there's some parallels in a sense of building your social network and building your kind of pipeline. I don't know how you want to kind of look at it like that. I'm from an expat family. My family grew up in Tanzania. Before they were in Tanzania, my granny was in India. Like it's an expat family. I've lived in the UK, the US, Africa, Hong Kong, and now here.
Wow.
So my view of moving around the world is it's such an easy thing to do. You just lift up, pack your suitcase and go and give it a go. Like wherever you end up, where building a business in a new country is really hard. It depends on how you do it. Like if you do it the kind of the West Coast way, which is you build everything for the US in the US, and then because they dictate how the world consumes technology, that customers will come and consume that US technology from abroad. And then once I've got customer base of X amount of customers, then I move to that country, right? That's what dictates the move, not what we did, which we moved with no customers. So we're pretty much a startup in this environment. So it's and like in that first example of the West Coast way, it's your product doesn't change. It's just all you're doing is starting the go-to-market piece. Well, we've had to do a whole part around, okay, product development and what does someone want to consume. And because it's a new market, it's not something, we're not going and creating a CRM and going, let's just look at Salesforce. We're building this for the first time. And there's a element of Henry Ford, which is if I asked people what they wanted, they'd ask for a faster horse, right? So we have to kind of think about, okay, what does the person in 10 years want? And what does that look like? So it's been challenging, where moving countries for me is easy. Other than visas in Australia, that's hard.
See, I had the opposite. My visa when I moved everywhere else was super difficult. But Australia, I was on, in essence, someone else's sponsorship. So
yeah, lovely. De facto. That's the one you want. Yeah.
I'm interested to hear what your approach to your role at Privy as country manager is. And does it kind of differ, I suppose, in approach from roles you've had in the past at different companies? Is there anything that you've learned from those old roles that you've kind of dropped from how you act in your role today, or maybe added to how you kind of go about your day-to-day role?
Yeah, there's similarities and there's differences. I think I've always been in the go-to-market space. So the sales and marketing organization, I'm the kind of pointy end of the spear, which is very aligned to what we need to do in Privy. The big difference with this role is kind of product input. The other part is, having worked for large US software companies like Okta, if I say, hey, we should change this to the product, no one listens to you. All the product development is done out of San Fran and no one's listening. Where here, if I say something, they go and start building it. So whereas I kind of built this kind of way of working of just throw requests out there in the old world, no one's going to listen. And if it's a good enough request, 1 in 50 might make it through. Where here, 50 out of 50 would make it through. So I've really had to adjust how I operate. And I think that I've always followed flashy, shiny things. So that's why cloud was interesting to me in the first place. And then I was the DevOps leader, and then it was this, and then it was this, and then it was this. And it was always whatever's flashy and shiny. So I think that what I do really well is understand what the product and the value is, and then build a North Star around that, and then go and get people excited and get people on the boat, be that internal teams, be that customers, be that partners, whatever they are. The more people I can get excited about something. And then, so that's kind of probably the biggest chunk of my job. And then it's a case of just filling holes. So we've got a great sales team here. They do a great job at selling. We've got a great marketing team. They do a really good job at generating demand. So I'm looking, okay, what can I go and fill? And if that's, I don't know, the microwave's broken, so I need to go and try and fix that, then I'll go and do that. But if that's go and position to the board to request some more funding or show them what the TAM looks like and get them excited, I'll go and do that. So the biggest piece is that North Star, get people excited about what we're trying to achieve, and then just plug the gaps.
I think that ties in a bit nicely to wrapping up a little bit. What would you say your key piece of advice is for companies looking to expand into new markets?
Have a strategy, which sounds like really weak, but like have a really clear plan about what you're doing and why you're doing it. Intrinsically understand what that market is and what it's going to give you, and make sure that what you want to achieve and what the market can give you actually align. Because once you get that part really like tightly defined, then everything is kind of, okay, well, these are the steps I need to go and do. I think immerse. So make sure that you really understand, not just at a surface level, but actually understand those markets. And it's the same for whether you're going horizontally or vertically, right? You could be going to a new country, you could be releasing a new product, you could be going into a new industry. It's the same each time. Understand it, have a strategy, and immerse within it so you intrinsically understand.
Well, that's about all the time we have, I think, for this episode of the Paal15 podcast. Rob, thank you so much for joining us on the episode.
Thank you very much.
Laila as well, thank you for joining. I'm sure we'll have you back on again soon.
Thanks, Matt. And obviously, thanks, Rob.
And if you've enjoyed this episode, please make sure to check out all of our previous editions on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Music. Just search for Paal15 Podcast or head to paal15.com. As ever, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.